Getting onto the housing market as a new homeowner was horrible. It is perhaps one of the worst experiences you can possibly have, especially when you're getting your first mortgage and then finding out just how much it's going to set you back. That, of course, says nothing to the insane amount of time you're paying that thing off for. Worse if you're seemingly allergic to long-term employment like I am. Still, I feel like I've lucked out here. Living in my parents' old house has become untenable, in no small part due to the normal societal convention of, if you're older than 18, you should have your butt out that door, that many of us love so much. So I was set with having a house hunt as best as I could. It's not like I was ever what you call close to my parents. My dad seemed distant at times, but I reckon you can attribute that to the fact that he grew up in a time where affection was a dirty thing. You know, that time period where showing a bit of ankle would get you canned. Either way, money was something of a nebulous quality when you look for a place where you won't have to sleep on the road. Usually, people like to picture it as this chance to start a fresh new life. That by buying a house it makes you seem like more of a man. Well, here I am, a dirty and desperate man who takes terrible care of himself. Lucking out with someone wanting to offload a house he said he had been in his family for generations. Of course, the sell sounded way too good to be true. Some random shack was willing to sell this house to some half-jobless deadbeat. Needless to say, there was indeed a catch. Hence, my complaints about mortgages. My bank was always crap to me in the best of times, and now that I was saddled with this cheap shack, they were taking the worst of times and decided to dance on my unfilled grave. Apparently, I was going to have to take out 2 mortgages on this place, just to cover the costs of the repairs that were going to be needed. Absolutely wonderful, I know. However, I still really feel like I lucked out here. There's only so much time in this world, and as much as I would like to spend it all complaining, there are better things for me to be doing. Like, for example, finally being able to rest my weary legs on the nice sofa chair combo that the previous owner had set up. It was pristine, had some fine quilting covering the otherwise well-crafted leather, and most importantly of all, it was comfortable. The whole place, contrary to the repair cost, was actually in very good condition. Once you pulled away all the plastic covering on the floor and furniture, it looked like the picture of a modern house. It had all the expensive room, all the quality items, and it even had decent lighting that wouldn't blow a fuse every 6 hours. It did make me wonder why it had such an exorbitant repair cost attached to it. The only reasonable explanation that I could come across was that the real estate agents were screwing with things again, because apparently bubbles in economics are really cool. However, as I ascended up them creaky pretty white steps, taken in the marvel of the nice stained glass that was patterned into roses in the window, I saw why that I suddenly struck down by the almighty dollar. The entire second floor was decrepit. Like on the level that you would have to wear a hazmat suit for fear that something was seriously wrong with the place. It didn't smell per se, otherwise I would have found out about it on the way to the door, despite the fact my sense of smell doesn't really exist. It just seemed especially desolate, with none of the nice flooring that I had seen below it. It was clear that something had been here before though. You couldn't fake all the outlines of dust like that, nor could you really fake the nails that were still stuck into the floorboards. No matter how bent they got, they were always still there, and it only got me thinking that someone had done one heck of a hatchet job. Honestly, it reminded me a lot of the old attic that my parents' house had. That being the musty old types, the ones where the dust would get stuck in the back of your throat and wreak havoc on your lungs for the next couple of hours. Add on that one also being the type where there were only a few floorboards set across to walk over, with the cladding of the attic sitting there like a hawk waiting for you to fall through it. And I could have sworn that place was a death trap. Honestly, this place wasn't much better. The dust was just as bad, getting stuck down my throat and on my tongue with every step I took and every deep breath I heaved. The floorboards, while mostly all together, sagged with every heavy step on them that I took. Never mind that I had to avoid the ones that still had masses of nails jammed into them, because someone clearly couldn't hire a handyman to save their life. The terrible plaster jobs on the wall had only heightened my awareness of the fact. As I went in deeper, making sure to keep my steps lighter because a sagging floor was not going to be the cause of a trip to the hospital, a certain stench began to hit my nostrils, and it was one that I couldn't put my finger on exactly. It was nothing like the stench of decayed wood, which was terrible beyond every real stretch of the imagination. As I said before, my sense of smell is also not really one that's altogether. It borders on an almost complete lack of it, except for exceptionally strong smells. However, the closer and closer I got to the epicenter of it all, the more it began to take hold. It was sickly. I don't know how quite to explain it, but it took my nostrils for a spin for sure. Hooking its putrid fingers up there and making their nest, probably eliminating my ability to smell for good now. If I had to put a word to it, it just smelled like death, pure and simple. But that played as secondary to what I saw now laying in front of me, hidden right at the back of this bog-scented trash heap. It was an ordinary cardboard box, unsealed and no markings that could possibly tip me off without touching it first. Beyond the place smelling like someone had let one rip a few too many times, there wasn't anything too overtly wrong with it, but the ominous nature of it just sitting there open sent my mind into overdrive. With caution I approached it, hand over my nose, head held high, and ready to see the worst that this place had to offer. I didn't quite expect what I actually did find. Inside the box, and as pristine as the furniture below this abyss, was a set of cassette tapes. Alongside it was a sleek, polished, and silver tape recorder. It was not exactly what I was expecting to see, to say the least. Moving my head back down and devoting my full attention to the box, I detailed the full contents. There were 4 tapes in there, all labeled with numbers. At least someone was helpful to keep track of it. Had it been me, it would have taken a team of code breakers to figure out the correct order, given how labeling simply was so tedious for me. Remarkably, there was not a single speck of dust on any of them. They all looked meticulously clean, like they were polished day to day. The more that I thought about it, the more it didn't really make any sense though. The box had been opened when I had arrived, and somehow these tapes were clean when everything was settled with layers upon layers of dust. Shaking the thoughts clear for a moment, I could always figure it out later since it wasn't like my time was precious, but curiosity began to overtake me. I hadn't seen one of these things since my dad. He was big into them for some reason, always preferring to go off to his man cave to record his stupid man things. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. It seemed like a harmless enough hobby. Still, as I now pulled out the tape recorder, setting it on the one part of the floor that didn't sag, I couldn't help but let my curiosity keep growing. Fiddling with the first tape in my hand, I stared at the thing. The stench of the place was still omnipresent, but it had long taken a backseat to my new desire. What could possibly be on there? Looking back, I probably should have known to keep well enough alone. Fixing the cassette in place, having to fiddle with the edges to make sure the thing slid in properly, I took a small breath, not wanting dust and stink to assault me before pressing play. Hello, testing, 1, 2, 3. Jesus, these things are so fiddly. Some sick guy is probably getting enjoyment in heck knowing that his invention is causing so much misery. And I hope he's enjoying as he burns forever. Anyway, that's not what these things are supposed to be about, as much as I may like them to be. There's been something on my mind for a while, and I just need to let it off my chest before it gets a little bit too much for me. And people have been calling it inhumane and something that even the devil would be repulsed by. How could one man possibly be so evil to willingly take the skin and flesh off of 7 little brats? That's what they've all been parodying to these heavens, crying out for someone to find the killer. Supposedly they all imagine this killer to be some madman. I would hate to tell them that ended back in the 80s. Still, they've been searching for the killer for eons by now, but they never found the one behind it all. It was me. More on that later, but dang does it feel good to be able to finally say that. What the heck? I had almost taken too many steps back after hearing that last declaration, nearly falling victim to that sagging floor that was just begging at this point to turn me into chow. The man's voice, it was clearly a man. There was no way a woman's voice was that deep with the tact used here. It was so serene in that declaration. I could feel the removal of all the weight on his shoulders, like he was lifted by the declaration of what he had done to those kids. The logical part of me wanted to end it all there, wanted to drop the crap and leave. The scared part of me didn't know if living in this house with this up above me would be worth it, that these recordings were going to be gnawing away at my guilt for ages. The idiot part of me was the one that inserted the second tape and pressed play. Hey, I think I've finally gotten the hang of this thing now. It looks like that inventor of this horrible thing can't relish me anymore. What a crying shame. Regardless, I think it would be time to elaborate on what I said in my last recording. Now, what could a plain old, respectable man like myself want with what I did to those kids? I have a respectable job, a loving family, and a steady stream of income that most men would kill for. Surely there is nothing terrible laying underneath. Nothing that would drive a man to do what I did. Wrong. Oh God, I'm trying to think about how to explain. You ever know that one kid that always makes horrible decisions? The one that takes without asking, or the one that ends up breaking stuff you work so hard on and then lies about it? The one that you want to reprimand. However, because they're a kid, you can't really do anything to them without getting into some form of trouble. It's just so frustrating, to put into a single word. Daniel was always like that. Every single time he would be making some asinine choice that would drive me up the proverbial wall. He would keep saying that what he had done was an accident, but I know better than to trust him on that because he's a liar. He was always such a terrible kid. And then he acted surprised when I said that I didn't love him. I mean, did I give him any indication that I did? Did I smack him upside the head too hard that he started hallucinating? What a little pest he was. No matter how many times I tried to get him to leave, whether it was him begging for forgiveness or trying to lie his way out of punishment, he would stick to me like a bad stench. I don't recall when I first felt the urge to want to do it to him. Maybe it was a month after the fact, maybe a year. I don't know, and it doesn't matter at this point. All I wanted and all I desired was to see the life draining from his eyes. I wanted to feel my hands around his neck, and I wanted to feel the desperation he would give in trying to cling to his terrible life. Unfortunately, if I did that, then I would get caught, and Daniel would be allowed to corrupt people further and further until they all became insufferable brats. But fortunately, I came to a solution. I remained silent, quietly shaken in the stench-ridden hack that I had trapped myself in. It is said that humans have 2 reactions when presented with danger: fight or flight. They didn't tell you that Freeze was the unwanted stepchild. I could barely form a thought as the image of what he had probably done to that kid started to enter my thoughts. He sounded so overjoyed half the time, and incredibly bored the rest of the time. There wasn't the slightest hint of remorse in those words, and it didn't sound like he planned to add any later on. There were only 2 tapes remaining after all, and if these 2 were horrific enough, then I couldn't imagine what was coming my way the next time. I had to fight back bile and vomit from the smell and the images as I pressed the 3rd one in. Maybe it didn't have to be Daniel exactly. There's plenty of terrible people in this world that smile at you on the street as you pass them by. I'm sure their kids would grow up to be just as well. Plus, if they turn out just as terrible as Daniel, then that's just another arrow to my bow. They'll deserve it just as much as he does. Now, the question of, how do I lure them to their fate? Well, kids are always trained to obey authority figures, aren't they? It's not like they would be able to tell a real badge from a fake one as well. And of course, I had to make sure they wouldn't make too much noise. Whether it was a knife or a bullet, it didn't matter so long as it was silent enough to not get caught. Therefore, I could take the brat, do whatever I wanted without making a sound, and then leave with no regrets at all. Of course he had no regrets. What kind of person do you have to be to justify to yourself that there's something out there that makes this okay? Throughout my mind, I could only picture what those final few moments were for those kids. Having their lives ripped from them because some weirdo like this sounded so overjoyed with himself about it. Seriously, the way that he spat out, no regrets at all, made me sick to my stomach. It was an awful reality though. He was clearly psychotic, if it wasn't obvious enough beforehand, but it only made me think about what he said earlier. His motive wasn't just to get rid of the kids, but to do it with ones that seemed like his own son. What the last tape said in before I even realized it, I pressed play for the last addition to this horrid tale. My finger, however, was hovering over the stop button for every waking second of it. I didn't want to imagine this monster going into detail. I tried to play father to these brats, but it didn't work. I don't know why I thought it would. Such snot-nosed brats were terrible to their own. Why would it be any different to me? Maybe I just wanted a second chance. Oh, my head hurts. Anyway, who cares if some kids are meeting their end? All they did was take these brats that no one would miss. Hardly a cause for any real alarm. Yet here I sat, watching the uproar with nothing but a muted knowledge that they would never figure me out. I hid those bodies really good, and I hid them so well they're not even privy to the eyes of heaven. I was met with glorious chimes of silence. Never before had it allowed me into its sweet arms with the same amount of joy that I had showed it before. The stench almost didn't matter to me anymore. Until I finally decided to stand up, that was. It seemed like the position on my knees was helping me stave off the worst of it, because I was blasted with it the second that I got up. It was coming from every direction, off every single wall with no signs of stopping. And it only seemed like it had gotten worse due to the tapes. It wasn't until I started to lean myself against one of those walls that I started to realize just where this epicenter was. The creepypasta job. That could have only been done by someone that was unaware of how this worked. And with how this guy operated and where he said he had the bodies, and then the cost for the repairs. Oh God. And then I heard something. And now that I've said everything I want to say about my work, there is one last thing that I would like to say. You might own my home now, but I assure you, I'm still here. I've marked this box and seen these tapes so many times in my life that I can tell the difference in placement to a microscopic level. So, you better put it back and you better start running. It wasn't just the final part of the tape recording. It was a moan and footsteps.